Well, welcome everyone. This is another one of my processes videos, and so I'm just going to jump into it. When I was researching for a script that I wrote about the creation of the railway in my province of Western Canada, there was the Pacific National Railroad, and it was finished. And it had to be built across some very dangerous terrain in Western Canada through the Rocky Mountains. And the way the history is told is it was told through that the Chinese were brought here in large amounts in order to build this railroad. And it was very dangerous. Even Johnny MacDonald had once given a speech where he had said, and Johnny MacDonald was Canada's first prime minister, and he said that without the Chinese, there would be no Canada. Because the idea of the way they wrote our history was that the connection through the Rocky Mountains of our railway, built by a Canadian railway operator, the PCR, I think, essentially made the whole length of Canada. And while I was researching for writing this script, which I did complete, it's called Steel Dragon. My writing partner from a long time ago helped me fix the actual title, which I think is really cool, Steel Dragon. And anyways, so while researching it, I discovered that prior to 1870, and up until the 1900s when the railroad was constructed, there was very little British population in British Columbia in comparison to Japanese and Chinese. That the populations of Japanese and Chinese are what we consider Japanese and Chinese, because of course, we may be rewriting who all these cultures are. But anyways, so what was perceived as Chinese and Japanese by the British at that time, their populations were pretty large. I would love to actually talk to some of the elders in the Squamish Nation and any other more established with longer, perhaps recorded history to see how prevalent this was. But anyways, my research indicated there were larger populations of Japanese and Chinese before the British. And only when that railway was constructed did more British people end up moving west to British Columbia through the Rockies. In fact, my grandmother also made the trip generation later, but through the process of that railway construction. So why this was fascinating, and this is going to lead to a what if soon enough, and why this was fascinating, because you only have to look at the Parliament building in Victoria to see there's something strange in the neighborhood. There are people who believe, and I say there are people who believe because I leave it this open to the possibility that anyone could be wrong or right about something. This is about possibility. It's not about answers. It's not about who's right, who's wrong. Sometimes I find that when I listen to someone else's information, even if it's a fully scripted episode that I recognize could possibly have truth and lies in it, because we live in polarity. Well, we don't really live in polarity anymore. I think that we manifest polarity or into effect. But anyways, that's beside the point. The point that I was getting to is there are people in this world, and there is a growing belief, maybe, and remember, belief is only to hold an opinion. There's a growing belief that there was an empire called the Tartarian Empire, and that this empire was one of the older civilizations that existed up until possibly the turn of the 1900, maybe. I'm not sure about the exact time frame, but it is hypothesized or suggested that this empire went from where Ural was on the risk board game, because our maps change. Like, yeah, they definitely changed. They've changed throughout my lifetime considerably, I guess. But anyways, from that area, Ural, all the way across the Siberia, Russian, maybe even enveloping some of the lower areas below it, and then also taking northern China, all of Russia. And I've heard people talk about, and this is why it was kind of interesting when I researched my script, that also down through Alaska, which apparently is a very important area for, or was a very important area for the control of North America. And then, so all the way through Alaska, Yukon, down to parts of British Columbia. And like I said, you only have to look at the Parliament building in Victoria to see, maybe things are a little bit different than we thought. But this empire, which no longer exists, perhaps aside from tartar sauce, once again, I don't claim that. These are just things I've heard. And there are people who said that in order to destroy the remnants or the buildings of the Tartarians, that World War II, many of their battles were placed upon those cities which needed to have the memory of the Tartarians deleted from our history. It's noted that they are responsible possibly for great intellectual and artistic and industrialized, just many things. So where all this led to me, today, for me to be talking right now, is what if the China Wall was built to defend the opposite side? And I think this is a fascinating possibility to consider, because once again, I don't believe that there are any per se answers or right or wrong, or like, I'm not looking to give any answers. And especially initially, this was meant for me, for myself, in order to compose my thoughts and create art and message, maybe. Yeah, there's a mixture of art and message from this. But what if the China Wall was built to defend the other side? I've heard of, and I won't quote anyone saying this, but I've heard of that it appeared on some of the old wall that how do you say this? It appeared on some of the old wall that the outside of the wall appeared to be the side that was facing in on China, and that the other side of the wall that was facing outwards of China appeared to be the inhabitable side by whoever was defending it, if that makes any sense. So I had the opportunity myself to visit the China Wall in 2003, and the part of the China Wall that I ventured to, was on the outskirts, or an older part of the wall which was in decay. And well, I didn't have any knowledge of this, and I didn't even look for it. And that's an important part too, is because not knowing that this is a possibility, that the China Wall was built the other way, the probability of me even thinking about it, therefore me being able to see any evidence of, was probably nil. But nonetheless, I did get to venture and to explore twice, actually, the old decaying part of the wall before they rebuilt all this tourist areas and refurbished them, essentially. But this does open up a lot of ideas. First of all, it allows for it allows for people that looked Chinese and Japanese, for example, to move about the empire and therefore inhabit the farther outskirts of the proposed empire. And so when I discovered that Chinese and Japanese looking like people inhabited British Columbia in abundance in comparison to the British prior to the British Columbia even becoming part, it was as if it was you could probably say, some sort of transition of population. So previously that population had been the outskirts of one empire. And then as that empire was coming to an end and falling back in on itself, the populations were transitioning and they were preparing, instead of the populations coming from the so-called land bridge or the connection of the Bering Strait from Russia down through Alaska into British Columbia, that they were receding back to their empire, that the Chinese and Japanese or older variations of those beings were part of a different empire. Yeah. Anyways, but none of that is important. That's what just let it. But what if the China Wall does defend the opposite side? That's the main purpose of this talk. And it does really change everything because it changes the history of China. It would change the history of China. It would open them up to the realization that perhaps the history of China is a recent rewrite in order to try to establish a narrative for the Chinese and for the world overall. China once claimed the world's largest. China once claimed like a 5,000-year history, one of the oldest histories in existence. And now we are opening ourselves up to learning about the Babylonians and the Sumerians and, well, a lot of other different races and beings possibly that were here. And so it does open us up to rewriting it. And there has been a considerable amount of, spotlight put on the Chinese, like even Chinese medicine, for example. Well, other cultures did use similar types of herbs and such. Chinese medicine has gotten a considerable amount of spotlight on it. And then that separation from Western medicine and Chinese medicine has played a really interesting polarity of like right and wrong, good and bad throughout our history. But yeah, just something to think about. And as I said, this is not meant to say this is truth it's not trying to oppose anything. It's opening people up for considering the possibility of history being different than we remember it. And as I wrote in the comments for this video, and I thought it was really insightful as I wrote it, it opens us up for the possibility to see that our history of our civilization, our planet, are possibly rooting itself down into our religion is not what it seems. And thus it opens us up for realizing that perhaps we can also change how we perceived ourselves yesterday and the day before and a year ago. Perceiving ourselves and maybe our actions and what we went through as differently. And then that allows us to also equally look at everyone around us and see them going through the same things. Like first give ourselves a break and then give everyone else a break and embrace in forgiveness. But that can only be done when we start to shake up these ideas that we once had a program in our head that would immediately trigger us into possible anger or victimhood or whatever it could do, so that we wouldn't listen and we wouldn't open our minds up to possibility. And I guess these audios that I'm recording are more me just discussing possibility through insights or cognitive triggers that I receive from other videos, and then just thinking about it. And perhaps an artwork will one day come from this. I actually I recently deleted like over 400 audios that were very similar to this. And it's because I wanted to use them as audios to put online, but I kept wanting to rewrite them in a more beautiful or edit them in a beautiful way. And, it really just didn't work. trying to add a new audio over top of old audio. And of course, we all recognize, or at least I recognize, I should say, I recognize that I am a different person now as opposed to the past. So when I go back and I change something, well, I might not only speak at a different volume, my energy will be different, my frequency will be different, my thoughts will be different, my body has changed. So yeah, I think this is a better avenue for it. And of course, this only, I recognize that as I get more comfortable, there'll be less pauses, which will be good. But the pauses will always be there in this format simply because I'm not re-recording it 1,000 times and it's kind of flowing through me. And which, of course, I don't know why I use superlatives, which I see as more of wisdom, which I will be discussing in a future video, the difference between wisdom and knowledge. And yeah, I had a huge amount of insights one day from a beautiful woman named Kim Gogan. And she helped illuminate a few things which snapped together like Lego, suddenly a lot of other things that I had been thinking. So anyways, I hope that there's something to be deemed from this, perhaps an inspiration. I will link something to do with the Tartaria buildings. And yeah, one day I hope to find a production team who wants to film my movie regarding the Chinese. It's a story of a man and a woman who met when they were kids in China. And then because of economic conditions, although they had embraced an early love within their youth, they were torn from each other, only to meet up together in a small railroad building camp in British Columbia, in which he has come to Canada in order to work on the railroad, in order to support his wife and son back in China. And she arrives in the camp as one of the prostitutes because her family had died, and so she was left to fend for herself, and she reunites with him in this camp. And I tried to be as authentic to what I perceived to be history at the time of creating it. But of course, that led through the journey of reading, research, and having intuitive feelings about the truthfulness of it. So yeah, you want to rebuild something, possibly you burn it down and blame it on something else. But anyways, so I hope one day to see that out there, although I recognize that the history might be possibly in error now. However, the story was truly written about the love between the man and the woman and the tragedy that goes along with in a situation like that. But yeah, I really look forward to that being out there in a movie-like format. And yeah, that's all those hours of writing. That is what led me to this point to even consider, what if the China Wall was built to defend the opposite side? Well, thank you for listening with me. I don't know if anyone joined me today on this. However, I'm sure in the future, I'm positive in the future, there will be more. I'm going to put this up in its full totality. I'm not too concerned about anything I said. Well, I never really am. It's all said for purpose, right? Love and light.